Carroll County, Maryland, Thursday, October 1st, 1863, 10:30 at night. The fire was low, and the translation was in his hand, and Father Edmund Callahan sat at the table in the rectory of St. John the Baptist Church in Westminster, Maryland, and read what he had written. And then he held the paper over the candle flame and watched it burn. He was 51 years old. He had been a priest for 24 years, ordained by the Archbishop of Baltimore in 1839, and he had served the Carroll County Parish since 1847. He had studied at St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore and then 2 years in Rome, and the languages he carried from that education were Latin, Greek, and what his seminary instructors had called a workable reading knowledge of biblical Hebrew. He had never expected to use the Hebrew in Carroll County, Maryland. He had used it once in 24 years of parish life, in the summer of 1861, when a family named Seligman had arrived in Westminster from Baltimore, and he had exchanged a few sentences with the grandfather about the Psalms. He had used it again in October 1863, sitting alone in his rectory at 10:30 at night, translating an inscription cut into a flat gray stone that had come out of the ground during the excavation of his church's new foundation wall. The translation took him 4 hours. When it was done, he read it twice. Then he burned it. What he told his confessor, Father Marcus Webb of the Archdiocese of Baltimore, the following Sunday, is not in any document accessible to the public. What he wrote in his personal correspondence in the weeks following is, and what the stone itself contained, in a script that a 19th century Catholic priest with seminary Hebrew and 2 years in Rome could partially read, is still in the ground in Carroll County, Maryland, because the stone was never removed from the site where it was found. But here is what the Archdiocese of Baltimore and the Maryland State Archives have spent 161 years making sure you never ask about. Westminster, Maryland sits in the Piedmont region of Carroll County, 30 miles northwest of Baltimore, on ground that had been farmed by German and Scots-Irish settlers since the mid-18th century. The county had been formed in 1837, Westminster incorporated in 1818, and St. John the Baptist Church had served the Catholic community of the town since 1851, when the current building replaced an earlier structure that had occupied the site since the 1790s. In October 1863, the church was undertaking an expansion of its foundation wall to accommodate a planned addition to the nave, a project that had been approved by the Archdiocese and was being carried out by a local contractor named George Fry, a 42-year-old builder whose firm had done most of the significant construction work in Westminster since 1850. George Fry's crew had been excavating along the south side of the church's existing foundation for 3 days when the stone appeared. It was at a depth of approximately 6 feet below the current surface grade, embedded in the clay substrate that underlay Westminster's thin topsoil, at a position that placed it beneath the earliest structure on the site, beneath the 1790s building, beneath whatever had occupied the ground before that building. The stone was approximately 2 feet by 18 inches, flat on both faces, and the crew foreman, a 29-year-old man named Patrick Boyle, who had been with Fry's firm for 6 years, recognized immediately that it was not a random piece of fieldstone. The flat faces were worked, smooth and even, the edges cut rather than broken. The lower face, which had been resting on the clay, was blank. The upper face had markings. Boyle sent a boy to the rectory to fetch Father Callahan before his crew did anything further. He had been raised Catholic, and he understood that a marked stone beneath a Catholic site was a matter for the priest before it was a matter for the contractor. Patrick Boyle had been in the trench with the stone for approximately 20 minutes before he sent the boy. He had examined it carefully without removing it from its position in the clay because he understood instinctively that displacing a marked stone from its original orientation might matter to whoever was going to be called to assess it. He was a careful man in his work. George Fry did not keep careless men on his crew for 6 years, and his caution in those 20 minutes preserved something that might otherwise have been lost. He noted the stone's orientation before he touched it. The upper face with the markings was face up, not by chance tilted but precisely level, as if it had been placed with deliberate horizontality and had maintained that placement through however many centuries the clay had held it. He noted also that the clay immediately surrounding the stone showed no disturbance, no root infiltration, no animal burrow, no settlement crack, suggesting the stone had been in that position, undisturbed, for a very long time. He noted this verbally to Callahan when the priest arrived, and Callahan noted it in turn in the notebook page where he made his preliminary observations of the site before beginning the copy of the inscription. That notebook page exists. It is separate from the pages on which Callahan made his inscription copy and worked out the translation. Those pages he burned. The preliminary observation page describes the stone's dimensions, its orientation, the level placement in the clay, and Boyle's account of the undisturbed surrounding substrate. Callahan did not burn the preliminary observation page because it contained no translation, only physical description. The preliminary observation page is in Callahan's parish records for 1863, which are in the Archdiocesan Archive in Baltimore. They are catalogued as Miscellaneous Parish Correspondence and Administrative Records. The finding aid for the Carroll County Parish Records lists the 1863 folder as containing routine administrative correspondence and construction-related documents. The preliminary observation page, with its physical description of the stone, is a construction-related document. It is in the folder. It has not been identified as significant by any researcher who has processed the collection. Callahan came to the excavation that afternoon. He looked at the stone in the trench and saw immediately that the markings were not Latin and not any script he associated with standard European stone-cutting or masonry tradition. He had seen stonemasons' marks on foundation stones before, the personal symbols that craftsmen cut into their work as a form of signature. These were not that. They were systematic, organized in lines, running horizontally across the upper face in what he recognized as a writing system because he had spent enough time with written languages to know organized information from decorative pattern. He recognized elements of what he saw, not all of it. Elements. He had Boyle and his crew leave the stone in place and told Fry to halt excavation on that section until he had examined the stone more carefully. He went back to the rectory and got a lantern and his Hebrew grammar, the one he had kept since seminary, and came back to the trench and spent 2 hours with the stone in the afternoon light, and then the lantern light, copying the inscription into his notebook as carefully as he could, working character by character, line by line. The inscription ran to 7 lines. He counted the characters, 43 in the first line, which was the longest, declining to 21 in the 7th line, which was the shortest. The script was not Hebrew as he knew it from the seminary texts. The letter forms were related but different, as if the alphabet had been used in a variant tradition, or as if what he was looking at was an ancestor of the Hebrew he knew, rather than the Hebrew itself. He could read perhaps a third of it with confidence. Another third he could make a reasonable attempt at, drawing on analogies to characters he recognized. The final third was beyond him. He took his notebook copy back to the rectory and sat down with his grammar and his concordance and his seminary notes and began to work. 4 hours later, at 10:30 on the night of October 1st, 1863, he had a translation. He read it twice, then he burned it. The burning is documented in a letter Callahan wrote 10 days later, on October 11th, to a former seminary classmate named Father Thomas Doherty, then serving at a parish in Philadelphia. The letter is in the archives of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, in the collection of Doherty's personal papers donated by his estate in 1901. Callahan told Doherty that he had translated an inscription found during construction at St. John's, that the translation had disturbed him sufficiently that he had destroyed it, and that he had subsequently spoken to Father Webb in confession about what the translation contained. He told Doherty he could not repeat the content of the translation because it was now in the seal of the confessional, having been discussed in that context. He said the stone remained in situ under the site because he had instructed Fry to work around it, and because he did not believe removing it would serve any good purpose. He told Doherty he would not be writing about this again. The letter tells us three things. First, that the translation existed and was burned by Callahan's own hand on the night he completed it. Second, that the content of the translation was disturbing enough to a trained Catholic priest with seminary Hebrew that he felt compelled to discuss it in the context of confession. Third, that the stone was left in place. Thomas Doherty kept Callahan's letter. He died in 1889, and his papers passed to the Philadelphia Archdiocesan Archive, where they were processed and made accessible in 1923. A researcher named Sister Catherine Quinn, a historian working on a history of Maryland Catholicism in the Civil War period, found the Callahan letter in 1947 while working through Doherty's correspondence and noted it in her research files as potentially significant. She wrote a query to the Carroll County Historical Society asking about the St. John's construction records from 1863. The Historical Society's response confirmed the existence of George Fry's construction contract for the foundation work and noted that Fry's job records had been donated to the Society by his estate in 1904. Sister Catherine's query and the Historical Society's response are in her research files, which are in the archive of the College of Notre Dame of Maryland in Baltimore. Her published history of Maryland Catholicism, completed in 1953, does not mention the Callahan letter or the Carroll County stone. She set it aside. She noted it and set it aside, and it has been in the Philadelphia Archdiocesan Archive for 100 years. George Fry's job records for the St. John's Foundation project are in the Carroll County Historical Society in Westminster. They include his original contract with the Archdiocese, his labor records, his materials invoices, and a site log in which he noted daily progress on the excavation. The entry for October 1, 1863 reads, "Work halted on south section per Father Callahan's instruction. Marked stone found at 6 feet. Priest called." The entry for October 3 reads, "Work resumed on south section, stone left in place per instruction. Proceeded north of stone position." The stone is noted once more in a final site note at the end of the project. Marked stone at 6 feet, south section, not removed per Father's direction, left in clay substrate. Fry's job records do not describe the markings. Fry was not a man who read ancient inscriptions, and did not pretend to be. He noted the stone the way a professional builder notes an obstacle to work. Factually, without interpretation, and with the practical resolution that his employer had directed. The Carroll County Historical Society's finding aid lists the Fry collection as including job records for 37 projects between 1850 and 1878. The St. John's Foundation records are in the collection. The collection is accessible by appointment. The stone itself is presumably still in the clay substrate at approximately 6 feet below the south wall of the St. John the Baptist Church in Westminster, Maryland, because no subsequent construction record at the site documents its removal. The church underwent a second expansion in 1891 and a renovation in 1937 and a restoration in 1978. None of the three projects' construction records, which are in the Archdiocesan Archive in Baltimore, mentions the stone. Either no subsequent excavation reached the depth and position of the 1863 find, or the stone was encountered and not noted, or the stone was encountered and the notation was not preserved. The most likely explanation, given the depth, 6 feet below any standard foundation maintenance excavation, is that no subsequent work disturbed it. It was below the work zone in 1891, in 1937, and in 1978. It is below the work zone now. What Callahan translated and burned is not recoverable. What the stone contains, in a script that a trained linguist with Hebrew background could read in part in 1863, is still readable to anyone who can access the stone. The inscription's relationship to biblical Hebrew, as Callahan described it to Doherty, places it within a family of Semitic writing systems whose presence in the American interior before European contact has been the subject of intermittent academic argument since the 19th century. The Los Lunas stone in New Mexico, a large, flat boulder bearing an inscription in a Paleo-Hebrew script first noted by academic observers in 1933, but known to local residents for generations before that, displays a character set related to the script Callahan described, and has been dated by geological analysis of the weathering on the incised characters to a period significantly predating European contact. The Bat Creek stone from Loudoun County, Tennessee, excavated by a Smithsonian field team in 1889 from a sealed burial mound, and initially described by the excavating archaeologist as bearing a Cherokee inscription, was subsequently identified by a Hebrew scholar at the Hebrew Union College as carrying a Paleo-Hebrew inscription reading, in the most widely accepted translation, a word associated with the land of Judah. The Smithsonian Institution, which had excavated the stone, reclassified it as a probable 19th-century forgery in the 1970s. The geological analysis of the stone's surface weathering, conducted independently in the 1980s, found weathering consistent with a pre-contact date. The Smithsonian has not revised its classification. The Tartarian hypothesis does not require a Semitic population in Carroll County, Maryland, to account for the stone that Callahan found. It requires only a literate civilization operating in the mid-Atlantic Piedmont before the 18th century, whose written record survived in a carved stone at 6 feet below the Westminster clay substrate. The language of that record, whether Semitic, Proto-Semitic, or a tradition that shared an ancestor with the Semitic family, is less significant than the fact of its existence. A script, a flat worked stone, 6 feet down, beneath the oldest structure at the site. Callahan could read part of it. The part he could read disturbed him enough to burn the translation and take the content to confession. He was a man who had read the book of Job in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. He was not a man easily disturbed by ancient text. Father Marcus Webb, who heard Callahan's confession in October 1863, was 38 years old at the time and would serve the Archdiocese of Baltimore for another 33 years, retiring in 1896 and dying in 1901. He was a man of careful institutional habit who maintained a personal diary throughout his priestly career, a practice he had begun in seminary and continued to his death. His diary is in the Archdiocesan Archive in Baltimore, in the collection of clergy personal papers from the 19th century. The diary covers the years 1848 through 1900 in 52 volumes, each approximately 150 pages of Webb's compact handwriting. The volumes for 1863 and 1864 are in the collection. A researcher examining those volumes would find, in the entry for the second week of October 1863, a notation that Webb had heard a confession involving a matter of unusual doctrinal weight, and that he had spent time in prayer over the appropriate counsel to offer. He does not describe the matter. The seal of confession is absolute in Webb's diary as in his life. He notes the experience of hearing the confession and the weight of it without disclosing the content. The notation is 4 sentences, but it corroborates the Callahan letter to Doherty with independent documentation. In the same week that Callahan wrote to Doherty, saying he had taken the translation to confession, Webb's diary records hearing a confession of unusual doctrinal weight. 2 documents in 2 archives in the same city, written by 2 men who never communicated about the matter in any other preserved record, describing the same event from 2 sides of the confessional wall. Neither document names what was said. Together, they establish that something was said, that it was said in a formal confessional context, and that it was of sufficient doctrinal weight to remain in the memory of the priest who heard it. The Webb diary is in the Baltimore Archdiocesan Archive. The 1863 volume is accessible to researchers. The notation is in the second week of October. No researcher who has examined the Webb diary has connected it to the Callahan letter in the Philadelphia Archive, because no researcher had identified both documents as related until the preparation of this investigation. What disturbed him is the question the documentary record raises and does not answer. The letter to Doherty is specific about the burning and the confession, but silent about the content. because the content had entered the seal of confession, and Callahan was a priest who understood that seal absolutely. Father Webb, his confessor, died in 1871, without leaving any account of what was discussed between them in October 1863. The seal of confession is permanent and runs past death. What Callahan translated and told Webb, and never told anyone else, has been in the ground in Carroll County for 161 years. In the stone he left in the clay substrate at 6 feet below the south wall, and in the silence of a dead priest's confessional relationship with a dead confessor, and nowhere else. A ground-penetrating radar survey of the south wall area of St. John the Baptist Church in Westminster, Maryland, would locate the stone within a morning's work. Such a survey requires no excavation and no disturbance of the existing structure. It requires permission from the current parish and from the Archdiocese of Baltimore. The Archdiocese's Historic Preservation Office has authority over such surveys at historic Catholic sites in Maryland. A formal request to the Historic Preservation Office for a non-invasive survey of the South Wall Foundation area, citing the Fry construction records in the Carroll County Historical Society, has not been filed by any researcher or institution. The Archdiocese is not aware, as far as any accessible record indicates, that its own archive in Philadelphia holds the Callahan letter that documents what was found at that site in 1863. The physical archaeology of the Westminster site adds a dimension to the documentary record that the archival evidence alone cannot provide. The St. John the Baptist Church building that stands on the Cranberry Street site today is the 1863 structure, substantially modified by the 1891 nave addition and the 1937 renovation, but built on the same foundation that George Fry's crew extended in October of that year. The south wall of the original building, the wall along whose exterior Fry's crew was working when Boyle found the stone, is still the south wall of the current building. The clay substrate at 6 feet below the south wall exterior is accessible to ground-penetrating radar from the surface without any excavation or disturbance of the existing structure. The GPR technology commonly used for archaeological site assessment in the Mid-Atlantic region penetrates to depths of 2 to 3 meters in clay-bearing soils, well past the 6 feet where the stone was found. A standard half-day GPR survey of the south wall exterior, using equipment available from any archaeological survey firm in Maryland, would locate the stone or establish that it had been removed at some point after 1863. The Carroll County Preservation Society, which monitors historic structures in Westminster and maintains records of construction activity at listed sites, has no record of any excavation work at the south wall exterior of St. John the Baptist Church since the 1937 renovation. The 1937 renovation focused on the interior and the roof structure and did not involve foundation work on the south side. The stone, on the best available evidence, is still at 6 feet below the south wall exterior, in the clay substrate where Boyle found it and where Callahan directed Fry to leave it. It has been there for 161 years. The GPR survey that would confirm its presence or absence requires 1 phone call to an archaeological survey firm, 1 letter to the parish, and 1 letter to the Archdiocesan Historic Preservation Office. None of those 3 contacts has been made by any researcher or institution. The stone is at 6 feet. The equipment to find it is available. The permission to look has not been requested. The Carroll County Historical Society in Westminster is open Tuesday through Saturday. The Fry Collection Finding Aid is on the Society's website. The Philadelphia Archdiocesan Archive is accessible to researchers by appointment Monday through Friday. The Callahan letter is in the Dougherty Papers. The Dougherty Papers have been accessible since 1923. The connection between the Philadelphia letter and the Westminster construction records has not been made in any published research since Sister Catherine Quinn set the question aside in 1947. Father Edmund Callahan, 51 years old, Thursday, October 1st, 1863. The fire was low and the candle was burning, and the 4 pages of his notebook in which he had worked out the translation across 4 hours were in his right hand. He had read what he had written twice. He held the pages over the flame, and the paper caught at the corner and burned inward, and he held it until the heat reached his fingers, and then he set the last corner in the ashtray on the table and watched it finish. He was a man who had read the Psalms in 3 languages. He had spent 24 years in a Carroll County parish, giving last rites to farmers and their children, and listening in the confessional to the ordinary sins of an ordinary county. He had translated a stone that someone had cut and placed in the ground and covered with 6 feet of Maryland clay before the oldest building on that site existed. What the stone said was something that a priest with his education and his faith found necessary to destroy and to confess. The stone is at 6 feet, south wall, St. John the Baptist Church, Westminster, Maryland. The clay above it has not been disturbed since George Fry's crew went around it in October 1863 and resumed work to the north. The inscription is in the same condition it was in when the clay sealed it, however long before 1863 that was. The translation is gone. The stone is not. The well digger in Fayette County, the undertaker in Pike County, the photographer in Humboldt County, each of them made a record that survived. Callahan made a record and destroyed it. What remains is the record of the destruction, the letter in Philadelphia, the construction log in Westminster, the stone at 6 feet. The evidence of what was found, not what it said. Evidence is what survives when the witness chooses silence. The stone chose nothing. The priest